welcome to Fun Scale Models. This series is focusing on building the Fun Scale Park Flyer P40C Tomahawk. In this episode, we'll be building the tail feathers. In the interest of time, I'll be speeding up the video in some of this episode. Here you can see all the horizontal parts have been removed from the sheet and lightly sanded to remove the tab points. I'm using standard push pins to keep the parts from sliding around. Whenever possible, I try and limit pushing through the wood itself, as that sometimes can weaken the structure. Here I'm using fast CA to keep one of the parts in place. I'm also using T-pins. These are about 1/32 in diameter and work great for spacing, as you'll see later. And again, another pin just to keep stuff from moving around. Once I have the overall structure where I want it to be, I'll put a couple of drops of quick CA to tack everything in place. Something I did notice about this particular bottle is it might have been a bit older and it took longer than usual for it to tack up. So you'll see me moving some stuff around here. I later replaced the bottle and everything dries as quickly as it would normally. So we'll go ahead and we'll add a gusset to one of the corners here. This is just made from scrap 3/32 sheet. You can use your X-Acto and a pin to hold it in place, as well as adding CA. I'll repeat the process for the other half of the horizontal, which we can see here. I'm now starting the 3/32 square stringers. Using the X-Acto to make a small mark, I go ahead and cut it to length. If need be, you can also use a sanding block just to give it the fine adjustment and set it in place. Glue it with the CA and repeat for the other items. Next, we'll be working on the elevator. I've used some push pins and some T-pins for spacing here on either side of the counterbalance area. This will make sure that that elevator part is centered. Once I have that part centered, then I'll use the other parts in a line with that and using push pins to keep everything in place. Adding the other parts, getting them in alignment with the plans. And once I have them aligned, I'll use thin CA again to glue all the parts in place. Just a couple of drops is all that's needed. I'll also make sure that while that's drying, I'll add some additional pins here to keep things from moving around. There is a small part, H9, and go ahead and put that in place. So here you can see I've added the stringers to the elevator. We'll do the same on the other half. I thought I'd use the vertical and the rudder as an opportunity to show construction using wood glue. So we'll be using Tight Bond. That's this here. It sets up pretty quickly, but it does have a rather large nozzle, so you need to use a plastic lid to kind of pour out some in a smaller quantity, and then using a toothpick for the actual application. So you can see here, this part is the separation between the vertical and the rudder, and it has a pre-cut section in it to make it much easier for you later to separate the two parts. So again, using push pins, getting it set in place over the plans. I'll go ahead and apply some glue to the surface of this piece here. I also don't want to get on that surface, though. That's the separation line between the two. And again, another V part, going and applying some liberal amounts of glue in it on both ends, and then of course setting it in place. When you wipe off the excess glue, sort of wipe it into the seam. You see doing that there. That helps ensure there's a nice strong bond between the two. Keeping some push pins and some T-pins to ensure alignment and it doesn't move while drying. Adding the rudder parts, same thing on that forward-facing part. We don't want to add glue, but on the bottom of it to glue it to the vertical piece. Adding parts as we go, adding glue as we go, and just setting them in place. The nice thing about the wood glue, it gives you some additional working time, so you can sort of get everything with glue on it and then adjust it if you need to. Gives you some additional time for setting up, and then again using some pins to keep everything from moving around while it does dry. Usually dries within about 20 to 30 minutes where you can move stuff. A couple of smaller parts to add in here. I'm just using the X-Acto for handling it and actually dipping it into the glue and then setting it back in place and wiping the glue into the seam. Same thing with the other fillet. So we'll go ahead and we'll let this dry, and the next thing will be is adding stringers. So we're now ready to start adding in the stringers. I do recommend that you start with the longer ones. That way, if you do happen to cut one too short, you just move it to the next smaller stringer. And again, adjust them, sand them just like you did on the horizontal. Here I am sanding it a little bit to make sure it's a nice and snug fit. When ready, you can just sort of dunk the ends into the glue and press them in place. Wiping them off with your finger, you can also use a wet towel as well to clean it up. Here we have most of the rudder ones in place. Here's an example where I cut it just a little bit too short. You can see a gap there, so moving it up to the next size down stringer, gluing it and cutting it and gluing it in place. With this setup, we're going to go ahead and let this dry thoroughly, and we'll go ahead and move on to the horizontal and elevator next. The horizontal and elevator are now complete. Looking over them, we'll need to give them an overall sanding to make sure they're uniform in thickness. When the wood is milled, it's not always going to be exactly 3/32 seconds, and you also will have some areas like here where there was a little bit of the wax paper stuck. So using a block sander that I had and the self-adhesive sandpaper, using 120, I'm lightly sanding across it as I'm pushing down. But you don't want to push down too hard. This is a lightweight structure. It could crumple if you're a bit ham-handed. So just gently take your time working across using the big block, and you can do both sides and top and bottom. Another option you can do is to lay your sanding block on the table and place your more delicate part on top of it and use an additional sanding block to sandwich the part in. This helps prevent it from buckling and flexing. It allows you to sand carefully. With the top and bottom sanded, we're going to now work on the exterior edges using these smaller sanding blocks. We're not contouring the shapes, just making sure that the transition from part to part is smooth. One benefit of laser cutting is the scoring that comes from cutting it gives you an indication on how well you've sanded the part. So here is the sanded and finished product. We're going to move on to hinging next. I like to do that before I round the leading edges and sand down the trailing edges. It makes it a little bit easier for finding and cutting the spots for the hinges. There's a lot of different options for hinges. You can do the standard pinned hinge like this here. You can see there's a pin in the middle of it, and then there's a tab here and a tab here, and this is what makes your surface move. There's also these bar type pinned hinges. They do have them in smaller scale, but even on that size it's way too much for a model. So what I'll be using is this. This is considered a CA or easy hinge. It's basically a piece of plastic with some sort of material on the exterior, and we'll go ahead and we'll cut these into shape, and I'll show you how to install them. So here's our hinge material. I'll be using the grid on my cutting mat here. I want to do just a little bit more than ½ inch. And that's going to be the length of our hinge. So go ahead and line that up. There doesn't need to be a huge amount of hinge area for a model this small, especially for the speeds that we'll be traveling. It won't be a really quick model. As you get to more higher performance airplanes, hinges are an important factor you need to really take in consideration. I'll go ahead and I'll divide this up into the individual hinges. So here are 4 hinges that I cut from that larger sheet. You'll want to refer to the plans and the model that you're building to see if there's any indication on where the hinges should go. Because on the plans right here in this area, there is a 1/32 wire U shape that connects the 2 halves together, we want to make sure that we go outside of that. What I plan on doing then is adding 1 hinge about right here and another one right here on either side. So what you do, or what I like to do anyways, is to use the hinges as markers. So if it's going to go about there, make a mark on each side. Same thing. Now before you even do that, you'll want to make sure you determine which is going to be your left and your right and what's your top and your bottom. You'll want to maintain that alignment throughout this whole process, because even though you're going to mark it, each side is going to be slightly different than the other. With those set, I'll go ahead and I'll transfer these marks here onto the horizontal. And I'll do the same on this side. So you can see here the marks that are on the elevator. I like to, with a pen, draw the lines here. Now you'll know that this is the perfect width of our hinge. When we do our cut, we're going to make it a little bit longer on either side. That allows you the ability to make some adjustments, and it also makes it easier to get the hinges in and out. So go ahead and I'll mark this there. And then, sort of using my finger as a guide, I'll draw a center line for each one. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but we want to get in the ballpark. Now, I like to use pen on this side of the surface. Here we can use pencil, but this will also go into the wood a little bit. And once you sand this down to a curved shape, that dark line will sort of disappear, but you can still see it faintly because it did bleed in a little bit, and that's the benefit of doing pen over pencil in this surface. Let's go ahead and we'll cut these out now. So again, using a nice sharp blade, you'll carefully, along your line here, cut your slot. You want to be careful, you of course don't go into your hand. So what I'll do is I'll make a couple of passes, and then I'll look at it from that angle, make sure I'm pretty close to center, which I am, and I'll sort of let the blade do the work for me. So go there. You'll want to be careful. You hear some cracking. You got to be careful so you don't overstress this joint. If you need to, you just go back in a little bit later with some CA or wood glue. So, sort of, you can see that I've gone past the marks. And I'll also sort of kind of go with the dull side of the blade to create a little bit more space. And that creates more room for the hinge. Have our hinge here. Go ahead and we'll slide it in just like that. So you can see here that's one hinge in the correct location. We'll go ahead and make sure that we do the same on the horizontal and for the other marks. We'll come back after that. So I've now done the cutouts in the horizontal. We've got the elevator hinged, and now it's just a matter of lining up the hinge slots and pushing it in. So
There. So now that this is hinged, we'll go ahead and do the other side. From there, then we'll add the U bend and be ready to do the final sanding around the perimeter. So now we've hinged the horizontal in the elevator. We need to make sure that we have something that connects these two items together. So looking at the plans, it references that we need to use 1/32 diameter wire. This is a scrap piece that I think will be enough. What we'll do is it goes through right here, goes across and comes through. So it isn't a large piece, but it's meant to keep the two elevator halves moving in unison. So we'll go ahead and we'll remove one side. I'll go ahead and I'll leave this one in. Then figuring where we want to go in this per the plans, we'll very carefully find the center point. And just sort of rotating it because it's got I had previously cut it, so it's a little bit of a sharp edge. It just moves nice and smoothly in. So I'll be looking at it from that end and that way to make sure that it's as close to being 90 and not going off in one odd direction or not. So you can see in there's a small pinhole. So using my standard pliers here, which the width is about perfect for what I want here, go ahead and bend a 90 degree. Making sure that's 90 degrees. We'll see how that fits in there. So what you can do is you can very carefully channel out that so that the wire is recessed. Given that this is such a soft wood, you could even just simply push it with a little bit of pressure. And I'm going to also, so you can see it wasn't exactly coming out the way that I wanted it to. Small tweaking with the pliers. That looks better. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll rehinge this. This sort of sits on top here, not a big deal. And we'll look at it from the top. And this is where a marker comes in handy. So this will let us know about where we want to make our other bend. So I'm going to put a little mark on it there. Kind of tough to see on camera, but it is there. Again, I'll pull this back out. And I'm going to bend it right at that point that we had. So I'm putting it just like that. There's a bit of a knack to this because you want to make sure that you bend this bend parallel with that. Bending it. There. So you can see it's about where our red mark is. So I'll lay it flat on there. Looks like I did a pretty good job of making sure that these two are parallel in this sort of plane. So I'll go ahead and once again mount this in there. Now, because this has a little bit of red on it, what I'm going to do is carefully mark this side with some red. That way, when we go ahead and assemble this later, we'll know which side goes to which. So set these sort of back in place. Now, what I'll want to do is I want to make sure that that looks good, so I'm centered there. The same thing here. That end looks good. Now, what I can do is mark where that one will go. So I'll remove this, drill out the hole, trim this up, and make it one connected piece. So here you can see that the U-shaped wire is connecting the two horizontal halves, or excuse me, the elevator halves. And it's pretty close to being dead on. Now if I needed to, I could always take the wire out, slightly bend it if need be if these were not lining up correctly. But now, when I move one half, both half moves. That pretty much wraps up the horizontal, and the rudder will be hinged the same way. The last thing to do on this is I'll need to round these edges all the way around. One thing about these thinner and smaller models, you can get down to a nice sharp edge, but that does leave it more prone to dinging and damage. So usually what I'll do for these flat profile, thin control surfaces and horizontals and verticals, I'll just round this edge as well. I'm not going to get too sharp of a taper to it. And that concludes this video. In the next video, I'll be showing you how to build the fuselage. Thank you for joining us.